and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank IDSA for giving me the opportunity to come and present a perspective which may be slightly different from what has been presented till now. But I would like to ask your indulgence to listen to what I have to say, especially for every perspective that is presented, there is another side. And another side which often people might not want to listen to, but at times it might come back to ask you for your attention. If you look at transnational organized crime, it's largely the control, and looking at it in terms of policy and strategy, it is largely based on United Nations Convention. Now, before going into anything else, first I would like to look at United Nations' critical role in terms of what you would consider global governance, especially on certain issues. United Nations has a lot of expertise in looking at various issues. If you look at, there are around 534 treaties it has come out with, and most of it has not been able to get enough signatories, except for one, which is drug control. Drug Conventions 1961, 71 and 1988, it was able to get 182 signatories. That it achieved not with tact, but with coercion and manipulation, which is evident from the recent debate on drug convention in which Bolivia wanted to move out of the convention and asked for reservation with regard to coca leaf use. Now, if you look at drug abuse and drug use trade control, it started with policies which were not actually only looking at human suffering or drug use per se. It is always portrayed as so. But if you look into the details of the treaties, it is very extensive control on all state members, especially those outside the Security Council. What has drug control programs managed through the decades? It has not eradicated drugs. It has criminalized cultural use, especially in countries like India and other parts of Asia, even Nepal. Cannabis cultural use was the main form of drug, or opium use in certain parts. So it has brought in different forms of harder forms of drug. If you look at drug trade, you will realize trading in harder forms of drug became cheaper. Pharmaceutical drug abuse became far more prevalent. And also there is another side to it. When you look at the regulations made, there is regulation on trade of various psychotropic substances. That means not only trade control in terms of hard drugs, but also trade control in terms of, say, medicinal preparation of traditional systems of medicine. It is also a way of ensuring pharmaceutical substances is the only way of healthcare. I know what I'm trying to say might not be very acceptable to many, but this is the reality. And also there is another issue of precursor control, which were actually illicit chemicals used to, say, create hard drugs. But are all the illicit chemicals only used for preparation of hard drugs? No. It is used for other industrial purposes. Even potassium permanganate is part of the precursors. But that affects all other state members, industrial, other activities it can be used for. The potassium permanganate has many other activities. It is used for water treatment. It's used for certain biological other preparations. Now, all this will come under question. You have to create an extensive registration mechanism, and also it is also that you are answerable to what if large quantity is transported from one place to another. If you put a certain legal system or administrative legal system in place, you're actually giving up your sovereign rights to an extent. Now, there is also the issue of right over the natural resource you have. And if you look at substances like opium and cannabis. Now, if you take cannabis, say, cannabis has many uses other than just use for drugs. It is also in certain parts, certain forms of, it's chemically used for dealing with HIV wasting disorder. Medicinal use of cannabis in traditional systems has been disturbed in India because of this. So there's a need to, when you look at United Nations conventions, there's a need as a state member, what are the implications of it? Now, after drugs, if you look at in terms of transnational organized crime, what is the implication for a member state like India or any other country? Often than not, we are willing to give up all of concepts of freedom or privacy when we have something called a concept of fear. Terror evokes a lot of fear. It is a fear of the unknown. It's almost like sometimes when we talk about terrorists, we also talk as though they are from almost like outer space or somewhere else. Terrorists are also part of the world. They are also sometimes part of our creations. I'm saying this because you need to look at other sides of terrorism, which I'll be presenting later. In terms of Transnational Organized Crime Convention, the invasive measures are, because if you have to look at it in terms of long term, one of the requirements is that you have to change the domestic laws. Second, inference of objective factual circumstantial, it is not necessary you have to participate in a crime. Even if you have intent or knowledge, you can be arrested for it. That can lead to extensive arrests. And with regard to the fear associated with terrorism, it can lead to many people being arrested not only in the country's jurisdiction, also other countries. Then there's the concept of controlled delivery. It refers to the fact that you can pass on a consignment or illicit substance with the idea that whoever is in charge is aware of it, but not everyone. So indirectly, if during the process is inferred you have supported the passing of the consignment, you can be held responsible, culpable for it. Now, addressing the concerns of sovereign rights, you have Article 4, which says all countries are supposed to be equal and there's sovereign equality and territorial right. But is this implemented at all? When it comes to the issue of terrorism, you have instances of state members going to another state and carrying out what they think is appropriate for terrorism management. There is no provision for a quote-unquote victimized state to hold the other party accountable. If anything is done about it, it will be considered as another act of terror. So there is a need to relook at what is presently given as the only tool for managing organized crime. And also there is this concept of the global action often depends on trying to create a perception that most of the terror is just a criminal activity or at the maximum a deviant way of looking at religion. But is that all that is? The need, what they want, this perception is required, because if you need global action, you have to make the terror concept political. The moment it is politicized, then that means different state members can have different viewpoints on it. Now what I've tried to do is, since the concept of terror has always been looked at from say a security angle, and also with certain actors being far more prominent in looking at the issue in terms of, say, the focus is far more to use technology, armed forces to address the issue. But is that all that is? Because there are researchers who have looked at the concept of violence. Now, I know violence can be extensive. It involves various other kinds of violence, which here one of the authors have looked at interpersonal, institutional, and structure. The person has put terrorism as a complex issue. But what I would like to do is whether to explore what happens when there's an intersection of interpersonal, institutional, and structural violence, say in a conflict situation. Be it in a place like Northeast, or be it in J&K, or any other place, what happens? This is to just look at what would everyday life mean growing up there. Suppose, for instance, violence is considered to be child maltreatment or abuse. What do the children do in conflict situation? When they have curfew at 5, they have nothing to do. What do the often Northeast, everybody has looked at drug use in terms of a personal incident or individual problem. But isn't it also linked to the conflict situation there? What do the youth do when you have nothing and the only thing you interact with is the presence of conflict around? One of the easiest things to do is to abuse drugs. Or the only thing other than that they are allowed to do is to watch movies or watch TV. And there is also the issue, there's another threat in Northeast you can face from the insurgents. If you use drugs, if they are caught, they also start to question there was a time when they were taking extensive action of even threatening them with life, but that's not the case now. But the point is, when you're growing up in conflict situation, when you have situations where the interpersonal reality of a person growing up can be so pathetic, what does he view the world as? How will he come about it? There is also the question of institutional violence. If there is armed forces or army from another state controlling it always, how do you view it? Now, when you are in total fear, and there is other structural violence of not even having adequate livelihood sources, because very often then not development realities are affected, whether it's in Manipur or Nagaland or even in J&K. The daily life reality gets affected, everything becomes expensive, or if education gets affected. When all this happens, what happens to the individual is a reality we have to look at. One often finds that when there is an interaction between institutional and structural violence, a clear instance of this is when if there is attack by the armed forces on a group of individuals who are coming, raising their voice against certain specific issue. It so happens, it can happen that army personnel might shoot and a person dies. These are incidents that have happened. The media, the focus is only blaming the army or blaming the other group. But isn't it the problem at both sides? Army personnel is only trained to understand that he has to protect or safeguard the country against some sort of threat. Here, which he perceives is the local people who are protesting against the issue. Now, is it possible for the army training or the army personnel to be also oriented to a different kind of worldview, so that the immediate response is not force of an extreme kind? There's a need for us to relook not at the art of war, but as the possibility of an art of peace. To look at people, they are not different. They are what we created through as various circumstances, through as various policies which are very silent, but they are very violent in nature. When a person is living in such situations, I have friends in the Northeast, 10 years ago when they used to say they feel peaceful when they hear the bullet sound. That's a very sad thing. Because they are grown up, it's almost like a background reality. But is this what we want the world to be? Issues of concern here is right now, police strategy often focuses on strengthening institutional structural violence. The only thing we can think of is using force to push down the problem. But it rarely goes away. And with technology, we have tried to reduce our own human damage and ensure the enemy's quote-unquote enemy, the damage is maximum. So you distance yourself and you try to have an unmanned aeroplanes or helicopters to destroy things. But what are the collateral damages regarding this? Because all these collateral damages, when you communicate it through your media, These are all silent violence images for the rest of the people. This is not something which is the way everybody did not perceive it as something as a just act, because there is no mechanism. Say, if you look at the Transnational Organized Crime Convention, there is a mechanism to infer injustice based on knowledge and intent of individual acts of terror. But what about nations when they attack another without adequate rationale for it? Is there a way to hold them accountable? No. Why cannot that intent or knowledge and inferred from the actual facts be used to hold them also accountable? Why not? Then there is the role of social engineering in terms of looking at the issue of terrorism. Often, if you look at internet, there's a feeling that internet is no man's land. It's totally free. But there are certain issues that one has to look in terms of the sovereignty of a nation. Say, suppose religious beliefs of diverse viewpoints exist in total. Take for example India. There are many religions that have come and flourished. And it is not that everything always has been peaceful, but it has been peaceful without use of much of arms or technology. It has been peaceful because people actually were supportive of each other. So in that context, if you have a system where you can engineer, use technology like internet to engineer discontent, now who is accountable for it? How can you hold them accountable? Is it the service providers of internet accountable? And is that not also a crime? And if service providers are not accountable, are the countries in which they are based accountable? How do you look at it? These are the concerns of future I would like to present, because if you look at how Australia, UK and US are going about looking at crime management, there are private prisons. In US, if I'm not mistaken, there are 100 odd private prisons. In Australia, there are about 8, UK around 11. Now, why I'm asking is, often than not, many of these concepts of dealing with crime gets transferred. What is easily manageable gets absorbed. Now, with privatization of prisons and crime control, there's a lot of danger involved in it, because what will invariably happen is, for any private agency, the concept is profit. It is not management per se of a crime, or in terms of ensuring justice is occurred. There is a danger in this, is that people with might, if you look at certain issues like security, when it is privatized, it's whoever can pay a better fee will get a better security, which is already happening in certain parts. And countries when the government tries to disown its commitment, because I personally feel it's a danger is unless the state has to keep its control in terms of certain issues. Others, it will be a class-oriented differentiation might come about. And with regard to allocation of administration of punishment, also the issue of how it will be delivered across different class or race. If you look at United States, there's a large number of black community behind the prisons. So why I'm bringing out this issue is, in India, there's a lot of under trials in India who are languishing in jails. Now there's a need to be aware about what is happening in the other parts, so that we are careful that it does not happen here. There's a concept called social finance and crime control that has also come in. It is with, you have a social impact bond, whereby the idea being, since the government is unable to manage its it's actually ending up spending a lot of money in terms of crime control and its prison population and unable to show any outcome. So the idea being the private entities will come in. You can invest in it, and after some time, if the entities are able to, through the years, say reduce the number of population that goes to prison, then it is shown as a positive impact, and the investor gets some money and additional return for whatever is happening. Now, these concepts are very dangerous because if you look at various countries, often than not, people who are behind bars can also be people who are petty criminals or who are involved in drug abuse. Very often in developed countries is drug abuse. Now, what happens when social finance concept comes? The idea put across, what are the activities put across is that if you do work therapy with the people, they will be drug free with a time limit of 1 year. Now, work therapy for drug users, what does it mean? It means basically cheap labor. And then who will hold whom accountable? You will slowly have a system where everything will be taken over and controlled and delivered as per what is convenient by certain groups. This is a dangerous scenario. And it is in this context I would like to make a point that the role of private agencies in terms of governance of various issues should be restricted. This also brings out the issue in terms of right over natural resources, which has also become a point of conflict in many parts. Now, UN in its General Assembly in 6th session, it was happened in 1974, had made it clear that natural resources is the inalienable right of the people and no one can forcefully take it away. But is this actually being practiced? If you look at the reality of the situation, take for the example of gold mining and diamond. In South Africa, it was being done with the knowledge of all, even though apartheid government was there. So actually, even though this issue was brought up in the UN, nothing was done about it for almost decades. So it is almost like the UN structure, while it states it stands up for certain rights, in reality, it is the rights of certain people that are overpowering over others. That's all. Thank you.